All right, so now we're going to go ahead and create a test for our ratings model. Now, generally speaking, when you create tests for a specific model, the tests themselves should be about that specific model, not all the other models, right? So I will be creating users and playlists, but I'm not going to be testing all of the things related to users and playlists, but test the things that are related to this particular test and this particular model, which again, the core being the actual rating itself. So let's go ahead and do a few things here. First and foremost, I'm going to go ahead and do from Django.contrib.auth. We're going to import the get user model function, and we'll go ahead and declare user equals to get user model. Now this, of course, will give us the ability to use user.objects.all, right? So it actually gives us the model class versus what we did in models.py. This was just a string to the model class that's set in settings.py. Just a little different. So this is actually what we want to use here. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and do class rating test case, and it'll take in test case. So typically we set up our data that we want across the test in the setup method here, as you probably already know. And you might be tempted to say self.user_a is equal to user.objects.create username equals to user a. And you could repeat this a few times, right? Maybe we want 5 users, maybe 10. But I actually want to be testing the ratings themselves, which means that I want to have a nice variety every time I test it. So to have a nice variety means that I need a variety of users and eventually a variety of playlists. So that means that this method is not going to work. So what we're going to do instead then is define a method called create users. And of course, it'll take in self. Now what I want to do is I want to iterate through some sort of range. So for I in range 0 to, well, what number here? I'll go ahead and say 10 for a moment. And then we want to create the users here. Now, again, you might be tempted to use user.objects.create and then using maybe an F string to change the username each time. This actually is okay for maybe 10, but what if we wanted 500? Well, then user.objects.create actually falls apart. And what we should be doing is initializing a instance of the class without saving it, and then using user.objects.bulk create for these items. So then I'm going to go ahead and just say items equals to an empty list, and then items.append of that item, and then bulk create just like that. Cool. So that's the most efficient way to create a lot of different objects at once. So now in our setup, we would actually call self.createUsers. Cool. So I actually want to have an arbitrary number of users in here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass in the number, or let's say user count. I'm going to pass this in here. And then this, I'm going to set self.userCount being random.randint of, I don't know, 500 maybe. So a random number between 10 and 500. So I'll go ahead and pass that argument in as this create users in here, right? So I can pass it in as argument, or to make things simple, we could also just keep this in the create users method, which is actually how I'm going to do it. Okay, so notice that I am using random in here, which means that I absolutely need to bring in random. So we'll go ahead and import random from Python. So now what I want to do is test the actual amount of users, so the actual user count. And then after this bulk create, I'm also going to just go ahead and say self.users equals to user.objects.all. Okay, so let's go ahead and define test user count. And I'm going to test a few different things here. First off, I'll give my first query set, which is just getting user.objects.all. And we want to self.assert true, qs.exists, and then self.assert equal, and that's going to be qs.count and self.userCount. Okay. And then finally, I can go ahead and assert equal again, being self.users.count being to that user count, which it should be, right? So those all three of these should actually go through just fine if we created everything correctly. So let's go ahead and run the test. So python manage.py test and ratings. Hit enter. And again, user count is not defined. Oh yes, so this should actually be self.userCount. And of course, that's where the error was. Okay, cool. So now that we got that, we got a unique constraint found. Haha. Well, that's because of the string substitution here. That should be an I, not a 1. Okay, let's try that again. And sure enough, I created it, and we're all good. Okay, so that's a quick and easy way to make a bunch of users. Now, I want to actually take the same concept for playlists. So let's go ahead and import the playlist. So from playlists.models, import playlist. And we'll go ahead and copy the same thing. And we'll call this create playlist. Now, oftentimes I would actually not want to repeat myself over and over again with these same sort of iterations. But the reason I'm allowing for it here is because I might want to make my create playlist method in the future more robust. I might want to change my create user method in the future to handle things just a little bit differently. So in a test case, I often violate dry specifically for that because I want the flexibility in the future and not have to untangle code that just made myself or made the test dry or didn't repeat it. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that with playlist and count. Okay, so again, another random number, and this time instead of user, it's just simply playlist. And of course, it's not the user anymore, it's the title, and I'll just get TV show, whatever. I don't even think I need a unique value in there, probably not, but I'll leave it as is. And then we'll go ahead and do playlists equals to playlist.objects.all. Cool. So now I'll go ahead and call that. So self.createPlaylists, great. And we can test the exact same thing, right? So this time it's going to test playlist count. And you can kind of see where this is going. So we eventually are going to do this for ratings as well. So playlist.objects.all. And now this is playlist count or playlists.count. And that instead of user count, it's playlist underscore count. And I believe that's what we called it. Yes, playlist count. Okay, cool. So now we've got playlist and users, and again, we can test it out. Should give me the same values. Nothing really that surprising about this stuff, hopefully. And one of the things you might be tempted to do is to test all other kinds of things with the playlist itself. Do not do that. When you need to test things about or features about the playlist that don't pertain to this particular test, do it in the playlist app. Do it somewhere else. Do it with a whole nother test if you need to. But this is all about ratings, right? So we're just creating arbitrary data here so we can test the rating system, not so we can test the features of playlists or users for that matter. Okay, so now we've got playlists and users. I'm just going to break those down for a moment so we can see things a little bit clearer. Okay, so now what I want to do is test my ratings. So I'm going to go ahead and do create ratings. So it's actually kind of important that we create our users and playlists before we run create ratings, because the ratings themselves are going to be based off of those two things actually being in existence. So that means that we're going to go ahead and grab an arbitrary number of ratings. So very similar to the users here. We can copy that yet again, bring it into ratings. Okay, so I can keep items. Let's import ratings and do from .models import rating. Okay, so creating ratings, we're going to go ahead and bring in ratings bulk create and stuff like that. Okay, so this of course is rating. So I'm going to go ahead and break this open a little bit by taking a look at how we want to declare the rating itself. Now, first and foremost, we're going to want a user of some kind. Next, we're going to want a content object. So, comma, content and object, whatever that's going to be. So it's probably going to be a playlist object. Probably. It's definitely going to be a playlist object. User, of course, is going to be a user object. And then the value, which again, going back into our values here, right? So the choices is going to be based off of our rating choices. So let's actually bring our rating choices in here as well. And with this, I'm actually going to go ahead and use random.choice. And there's going to be rating choices. dot choices and the 0th element. But we'll leave it in just like this for just a moment until we finish everything else about this. Okay, so the user object, well, we actually want the user object based off of the current iteration. So how do we do that? And how do we get the playlist object based off of the current iteration? So what's happening here, if we look at these items of creating the users and creating the playlist, we set self.playlist to a query set, self.users to a query set. So that actually means that I can reference those things by self.users, and I could say something like first and self.playlists.first. And overall, that's fine, but all these ratings are going to end up being whatever the number is. All of them are just going to be based off of the very first user and the very first playlist. So instead, we want a semi-random way to do this by saying order by and using a question mark. So this gives me just an arbitrary order that Django does for us, where it gives me a random object then. That's it. And then doing .first gives me the first object in that query set. So this is a query set that's ordered by random, same with this one, and those both give me just random items there. And then random.choice is going to look in the choices list, which is what that is, and look for a random choice in there. This is invalid currently, but we will fix it in just a moment. Okay, so then the user count is not actually what I want. Instead, we're going to call this the rating count. Okay, and you might be tempted to also do a random integer of ratings, but I actually want to be more specific about the number of ratings that I'll end up doing. Because again, this is about ratings. It's not about the users or playlists. I basically always want to have a certain number of ratings so I can verify against that number. The floating number of it is not necessarily a good idea. That being said, we could also do the same thing for create users and create playlists, but I do want some variance in the responses for these ratings. Like the average value, I want some variance in that, not just the same average value all across the board. So we'll get to average values in the next one, but for now, we've got pretty much this test all set up. So I'm going to go ahead and test the actual rating count now, very similar to my other tests of counts, but this time the rating count should be a fixed number of just self.rating count. So let's go ahead and call this test rating count, rating.objects.all. We're going to test that it exists. We're going to test that it's equal to that initial rating count. We're going to test that ratings.count are equal to that rating count as well. And we've got ratings here as the query set. Just wanted to make sure that all three of these are the same. And now I'm going to run these tests, and I should get an error. Notice how long it's taking, right? So the longer or the higher or the bigger you make for something like this, the longer all of this test is going to take. That should make sense, right? So it's making all of these items, and it's doing it as efficiently as it can. There might be a more efficient way to do it, but as far as I know, this is the most efficient way to do it, and I'll explain why in a moment. But the error that happens, it says field value expected a number, but got 1 comma the string of 1. And I already know that that's come from this right here. So what random.choice does is it takes a random choice of a list of items. So what is that list of items? Well, if we go into python manage.py shell, which is literally what I would do if I had this problem, I would go into from ratings.models. I'm just going to import everything. Oh, let's spell it correctly. So from ratings.models, import all, and then I'll do rating.choices. And as you see, this gives me a list of tuples, tuples being the actual database value and the string value, right? So what's cool that we didn't talk about when we implemented this is this actually defaults to this, right? So Django is smart enough to actually start to default what that tuple value would be. I really, really like that about how newer versions of Django are working. So since it's actually doing that, that means our choices have to have, we actually have to select the first value in each one of these choices. So random.choice, let's see what it does. So import random.choice of rating choices.choice will give us, a random tuple So obviously we just need to get the first item in there. And I can be very confident that that's going to be the case, that this is not some arbitrary value, like it won't have a first item in there. Of course, I could also just do a random number between 0 and, or between 1 and 5, and then also having none as a value. But whenever possible, actually test the actual things that we're using in our models, right? So the rating choices is something we're actually using. We don't need to hard code the number out like we did on the count of items that we were going to use. Okay, so with that, let's go ahead and exit out of here. And Python manage.py, test ratings, hit enter. And it's going to take some time for sure. And now it should actually give us all of that. We should get all clear. Okay, so one of the things it's not currently testing is the fact of, well, is there somewhat of a distribution here? Or are literally all of these choices the exact same? So a quick way to check if they are all the same is just to literally check the value, the length of those values. So I'm going to go ahead and define test rating random choices, something along those lines, where now what I'm going to do is get all of the potential values from ratings.objects.values list of those values, and I'll say flat equals to true values. There's a lot of values going around here. So this values right here is actually equal to this, which should say value, not values. This is going to be, you know, like an actual set of values. So let's just call this value set, and I'll actually pass the Python set around it, which will get rid of all the duplicate values. So all we should actually see are these choice values. So 1 through 5, and then also none, which is what we saw in those tests before. If we scroll up a little bit, we basically should see all of these first values here as a result of this. Maybe not every single one, but definitely not only one of them. So we just want to do a self.assert true that the length of values is not or values set is not equal to 1, right? Or basically it's greater than 1. Let's just say it's greater than 1 because we don't want it equal to 0 either. Okay, so let's go ahead and run this. And now we should actually have all of those tests working out great for us. So something else you might do from time to time, a spelling error, but something you might do from time to time is actually test the number of items that you're creating. Okay, so in the case of users and playlists, let's put playlists down to 200 and users up to 700, and then ratings count down to 200. Not very many, but this should actually change the speed as to which this whole thing runs, and it does quite a bit actually. So granted, this is most likely because of the ratings, how many ratings we're actually doing, because it's getting individual objects, which is doing a lookup for that, and then it's actually running and creating all that stuff. So it does take a lot of time with these ratings. So if I did 2,000 or 20,000, it's going to start getting really, really slow. Okay. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and leave it back at 500, 500, and 1,000. So 500 playlists, 500 users, and 1,000 ratings. I think all of those are decent numbers for what we're trying to accomplish here. But again, if you're trying to actually test at scale, prepare for this test to take a lot longer. And I think these two right here, there's probably a little bit more of an efficient way to declare those two. But as of now, this works pretty good. Okay, so now what we need to do really is we need to test the average rating on any given playlist. And you might think we should do this in the actual playlist itself, but we want to do it inside of where we're actually declaring the ratings, which is the ratings test.